The elevator smelled like expensive cologne and old money. Jane Mitte noticed it the second the doors closed behind her. That specific kind of scent that doesn't come from a bottle you find at the mall. It clings to marble lobbies, penthouse floors, and men who've never had to check a price tag in their adult lives. She'd grown up far from places like this, often hearing her grandmother say that some doors were built exclusively for other people. Jane had spent the last decade proving that old saying wrong, busting open one locked door at a time. She pressed the button for the 34th floor, heading to an apartment her friend Cassie had offered up for a 3-month stint. Cassie had pitched it as a clean, quiet building, completely glossing over the fact that the lobby rivaled a 5-star hotel, and the elevator featured a mirrored ceiling, broadcasting exactly how exhausted Jane looked after a brutal 6-hour flight from Atlanta. She shifted her carry-on, exhaling slowly. Chicago. A new city, a fresh contract, and a clean slate. Or at least, that's the lie she kept repeating to herself. Let's get one thing straight right off the bat. Jane Mitte touched down in the Windy City strictly for business. She arrived with a rolling suitcase, free rent, and a highly lucrative job contract. She was a woman with an ironclad itinerary, but unfortunately, life has a funny way of blowing up your blueprints the second you step into an elevator. When the doors parted on the 29th floor, he stepped in, completely ignoring her presence. He was tall, wearing a dark blazer pushed casually up at the sleeves, with hair swept back as if it just naturally obeyed his command. His jaw was lined with a sharp, dark beard, the kind of grooming that takes serious effort, but is masterfully designed to look entirely effortless. He stood at the opposite side of the elevator, staring intensely at the doors. Jane checked the mirror, looked at the floor, and finally let her eyes wander over to him. He was completely unfazed, exuding that rare magnetic gravity where the whole room seems to physically shift just to accommodate him. She cleared her throat, entirely dismissed by the statue beside her, as the car rocketed upward. A wave of mild irritation washed over her when she realized she was holding her breath. Have you ever experienced that sudden hyper-awareness where someone is just close enough that your body betrays you and pays attention? That visceral reaction driven entirely by instinct? That's exactly what was happening in that confined space, and Jane absolutely despised that magnetic pull. When the doors chimed at 34, she stepped out in dead silence while he remained perfectly still. She made it halfway down the hall before his voice finally broke the tension, a low, unhurried gravel that seemed to land right on her shoulder. Wrong floor. She spun around to find him watching her with an intense, calculated observation, sizing her up like a puzzle he'd already solved. Jane verified the number above the door, then double-checked Cassie's instructions. 34B. She was right where she needed to be. She met his gaze head-on. "I don't think so," she fired back. A subtle shift rippled across his face, a tiny recalibration showing he was genuinely surprised by her pushback. The heavy steel doors slid shut, leaving Jane stranded in the quiet hallway, listening to the mechanical hum carrying him even higher into the skyline. Once inside 34B, she dumped her bags on Cassie's pristine white couch and stared out at the sprawling, overcast Chicago grid. Her phone buzzed with a text from a contact saved simply as R. It read, "First day at Baker Industries is Monday. Remember what we discussed. Keep it strictly business." She read the warning twice, slammed the phone face down, and stared blankly at the ceiling, fighting a losing battle to scrub the mysterious guy in the elevator from her mind. There's a strange kind of vulnerability that hits the second you drop your bags in a brand new city. You're miles away from your comfort zone, running on nothing but cheap coffee, sheer adrenaline, and takeout menus. Your guard is completely down. And as anyone who has ever tried to start over knows, that is exactly when the universe decides to throw a massive wrench into your perfectly laid plans. Baker Industries took up the top 6 floors of a sleek glass tower right on Michigan Avenue. Everything from the lobby to the way the staff moved through the corridors screamed one thing: you don't come here to play small. Jane walked in at 8:47 on a Monday morning, dressed in a sharp white silk blouse and high-waisted trousers, carrying her badge, her portfolio, and that specific kind of laser focus you only get after spending an entire weekend convincing yourself not to back out of a job that makes you physically sick. The receptionist flashed a perfectly trained corporate smile, letting Jane know Mr. Baker's assistant would take her up. Jane just nodded, keeping her expression completely unreadable. Stephen Baker was the target, a 37-year-old CEO who turned a mid-sized consulting firm into one of the most aggressive tech investment powerhouses in the Midwest. He was also the exact guy her real employer, a rival called Vantage Group, desperately needed intel on. Her mission was supposedly straightforward: infiltrate as an outsourced executive recruiter, put in enough solid work to gain their trust, and dig up the names and strategies for Baker's secret new division before handing it all over to Vantage and vanishing. It sounded like a textbook corporate espionage gig on paper, but plans always sound foolproof until you actually walk into a 38th floor conference room and realize the guy sitting at the head of the table is the exact same man from the elevator. He was already there with his jacket off and sleeves rolled up, deep into whatever was on his tablet. While the three other senior-level execs in the room glanced up at her arrival, Stephen Baker kept his eyes locked on his screen. She grabbed a seat near the middle of the table just as he finally looked up, letting their eyes meet for exactly 2 seconds before he casually went right back to reading. He didn't miss a beat, completely blanking her. Jane felt a sudden, confusing cocktail of deep relief, mixed with a weird sting of offense because he clearly had no clue who she was. Once the meeting kicked off, he ran it exactly how Jane figured he ran his entire life, fast and utterly devoid of fluff, carrying the heavy authority of a guy who stopped needing to prove himself years ago. He fired off sharp questions and absorbed the answers with direct, unblinking attention, skipping the polite nods and corporate filler words most people use to fake active listening. There is something undeniably fascinating about men who have built empires from the ground up and actually know their worth. They never feel the pressure to fill the dead air. While most people absolutely panic during a silent pause and start rambling just to kill the tension, a guy like Baker will just let the silence sit there, perfectly comfortable, waiting for you to say something that actually matters. It was highly intimidating, ruthlessly effective, and inconveniently attractive for someone whose entire job relied on remaining professionally invisible. About halfway through the agenda, he finally locked onto her, dropping her name into the quiet room like a calculated test. He pointed out her track record of placing C-suite candidates at Fortune 500 companies and demanded to know her exact process for weighing cultural fit against technical skills. The energy in the room instantly shifted as everyone waited for her to crack. Instead of rushing, Jane met his gaze dead on and explained that separating the two is a rookie mistake, because a candidate who clashes with company culture is a massive liability, no matter how stacked their resume is. She told him she always starts by analyzing the room and the people already in it, since you can't find the missing puzzle piece until you fully understand the rest of the board. He let that hang for a second before challenging her to reveal what she had deduced about his room so far. Jane held eye contact for just a fraction of a second longer than HR would probably recommend, coolly stating she was still observing, a microscopic flash of something registered behind his eyes before he locked it back down. You know the old saying about the loudest guy in the room being the weakest? It's completely true. The real heavy hitters, the guys holding all the cards, speak softly because they know everyone else is already straining to hear them. It's the ultimate power move. As the meeting wrapped up and the suits filtered out, Jane gathered her portfolio and nearly made it to the hallway before his voice caught her from behind. She turned to find him still anchored at the head of the table, studying her with that same measured, surgical precision from the elevator. When he casually mentioned the 34th floor, her stomach instantly dropped. He stated that she lived in his building with absolute certainty, and when she quickly clarified it was just a temporary setup, he gave a single knowing nod. He welcomed her to Baker Industries, but the heavy undertone in his voice made it crystal clear he was actually saying something else entirely. Tuesday was an absolute grind. After surviving 8 hours of back-to-back introductory meetings, where she had to constantly walk the tightrope of being highly competent yet completely non-threatening, Jane's face literally ached. It takes a massive physical toll to exist correctly in a room full of people you are actively planning to betray. As she walked back to her building, she tried to reframe the espionage as basic corporate survival. After all, she was genuinely exceptional at her actual job of recruiting and placing talent, which is exactly why Vantage Group headhunted her for this double-agent gig. They needed someone who could do the real heavy lifting, so the stolen intel would just look like an accidental byproduct of her success. Repeating the golden rule to never get attached, she swapped her corporate armor for a swimsuit, grabbed a towel, and headed down to the amenity floor on 33, situated dangerously halfway between her apartment and his. At 9 o'clock on a random weekday, the glass-enclosed rooftop pool was completely deserted, the heated water casting a pale, luminous blue glow against the jagged Chicago skyline. She dropped her towel, slipped into the deep end, and finally let the chaotic noise of the last 3 days fade away. There is absolutely nothing better than that sensory deprivation when the water closes over your head, muffling the endless gridlock of the city outside. For someone like Jane, who had been aggressively performing perfect composure since childhood, that underwater silence was an absolute survival requirement. She was floating peacefully on her back when the atmosphere in the room suddenly shifted. His arrival was completely silent, but she felt that undeniable drop in air pressure signaling that she was no longer alone. She quickly found her footing and spun around. Stephen Baker was planted at the far end of the deck. He was still wearing his dark office trousers and a charcoal dress shirt, though he had ditched the jacket and unbuttoned his collar. He had clearly been watching her for a while, and he had zero intention of pretending otherwise. "The pool closes at 10, his voice cut through the heavy, chlorinated air. Jane wiped the water from her eyes, refusing to flinch. She kept her tone incredibly steady. "It's only 9:15. "I know," Stephen replied, lowering himself onto a nearby lounger without breaking eye contact. "But you look like you're trying to drown the entire work week, and it's only Tuesday." Jane waded a little closer to the edge, crossing her arms tightly under the surface. "First days are always a lot to process. I was just blowing off some steam." A faint, almost imperceptible smirk touched the corner of his mouth. "You don't really strike me as the floating type, Ms. Mitte. You strike me as someone who's always calculating the exact depth before diving in." She tilted her chin up, absolutely refusing to give an inch. "And you don't strike me as a guy who spends his evenings policing the amenity floor, Mr. Baker. Do you always monitor your new hires after hours?" That is exactly the kind of unhinged, high-stakes banter that either gets you fired on the spot or completely changes the magnetic pull between two people. Stephen didn't get angry. He just sat there, soaking in the pushback like he actually enjoyed someone finally challenging him. "You should be careful," he said, his tone shifting from corporate boss to something quieter, almost protective. "About the pool rules?" Jane asked, raising an eyebrow. "About wandering around completely alone when you don't understand the layout of the building yet?" "I appreciate the concern," she shot back coolly, "but I'm usually pretty good at reading a room." He slowly got to his feet, picking up the suit jacket he'd draped over the chair. He looked at her with a heavy, unhurried intensity. "This isn't a room. It's Chicago." He walked toward the exit, his footsteps echoing against the wet tiles, but paused right at the heavy glass door. He didn't bother turning around. "By the way," he said casually, leaving the words hanging in the humid air, "the security camera on the northwest corner has been offline for 2 weeks. Maintenance is dragging their feet. Might want to know that." Jane was left standing alone in the glowing water while the city hummed indifferently outside the glass, entirely unsure if she had just been warned, protected, or simply observed. If I were standing chest-deep in that pool, my heart would be hammering against my ribs so loud it would echo. Because here's the terrifying reality of a moment like that. He didn't point out that camera blind spot to keep her safe from strangers. He gave her that information so she would know exactly where to stand if she ever wanted to do something she shouldn't. And having someone read your hidden agenda that easily, it completely flips the game board. The text from R hit her phone at exactly 6:00 a.m. on a freezing Thursday morning. 2 weeks in, "I need the organizational chart of the new division. Names, levels, reporting structure. You have access. Use it." Jane stood in her kitchen, wrapped in her grandmother's worn-out, oversized shirt, holding a mug of coffee that was still scalding hot. She watched the skyline shift from pitch black to that highly specific, moody gray blue, that only Chicago manages to pull off in the early hours. She fired back a quick text, reminding R that doing the job right takes time. His reply was immediate and razor-sharp. Don't confuse thoroughness with hesitation, you know the difference. She slammed the phone face down on the counter because he was absolutely right. She knew the exact difference. The brutal reality of playing a corporate double agent is that your survival depends entirely on staying emotionally sterile. You get in, you extract the intel, and you vanish without leaving a single footprint. The entire system crashes the exact second your target stops being a mark and starts becoming a real person. Later that afternoon, Stephen Baker summoned her to his office. It was her first time stepping into his inner sanctum alone, and the space was a masterclass in power dynamics. Floor-to-ceiling windows showcased a dizzying view of the city, while every single item on his desk was aligned with a surgical precision that screamed he arranged it himself, completely bypassing his assistant. A single, slightly blurred vintage photograph of an older couple in a garden sat quietly on the credenza. "Close the door and grab a seat," he instructed, his eyes still locked on his monitor. Jane obliged, settling into the heavy leather chair while he let the silence stretch for a solid 40 seconds. It was that same unhurried, agonizing tempo she was quickly realizing was his signature move. When he finally turned to face her, his gaze was dead on. "You're exceptionally good at your job, Ms. Mitte, significantly better than the last 3 people who sat in that chair." "I appreciate that," Jane replied, keeping her voice perfectly even. "Don't. It wasn't praise, it was an observation," he corrected smoothly, leaning back in his chair. "Being highly effective in your role means you naturally pick up on shifting dynamics. You notice patterns in the room that other people completely miss. That's literally what you pay me to do," she volleyed back, refusing to be intimidated. "Exactly," he murmured, letting the word hang heavy in the air. "Which is why I'm going to ask you a very direct question, and I expect an entirely unfiltered answer. Have you noticed anyone on the team acting off? Any subtle behavioral shifts?" Talk about a total gut punch. Here sits the CEO of a multi-million-dollar tech empire, completely composed, asking the exact corporate spy hired to infiltrate his company if she's noticed any suspicious activity. The sheer, terrifying irony of that moment is enough to make anyone break character. Jane kept her expression completely neutral, even though her heart was hammering violently against her ribs. "Nothing specific stands out. Why? Is there a problem?" Stephen studied her, taking inventory of her reaction, rather than searching for a crack. "We've flagged some minor information irregularities over the last quarter. It could just be internal sloppiness, but my gut says otherwise. I need you to trust those razor-sharp instincts of yours during your interviews. If someone feels off, I want to know about it." "I'll keep my eyes open," she promised, holding his gaze without blinking. "Good." She stood to leave, her hand gripping the heavy metal door handle when his voice caught her from across the room. It was quiet, almost entirely to himself. "Someone in this building is lying to me, Ms. Mitte, and I have zero tolerance for it." Jane froze, keeping her back to him. "Most people lie eventually, Mr. Baker. It's just human nature." "Not to me," he replied, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register, "and never twice." Here is the fundamental difference between lying for sport and lying for survival. When you lie for sport, it's an ego trip. You're playing a game with house money. But when you lie to survive, every single syllable costs you a piece of your soul. You aren't doing it to win. You're doing it to keep breathing. And when you look dead into the eyes of someone you are starting to respect and feed them a perfectly crafted lie, the guilt doesn't just sting. It eats you alive from the inside out. Jane walked out of the office with perfect posture, took the elevator straight down to the 22nd floor, and locked herself inside a bathroom stall. She sat there for 4 agonizing minutes, with her hands pressed flat against her trembling thighs, fighting to regulate her breathing. Then she meticulously fixed her lipstick, pushed the door open, and walked right back into the lion's den. Let's be real. The best and worst things in life usually start completely by accident. In this case, it was the rain. Chicago in November doesn't care about your plans or your outfit. It hits you with that brutal, horizontal freezing rain where umbrellas are basically just a polite suggestion. It caught Jane completely off guard. She was stranded 2 blocks from the office at 7:30 p.m. in the wrong shoes and zero coat after a grueling late meeting. She bolted into the closest shelter she could find, a tiny, narrow Italian joint on Erie Street, boasting fogged-up windows, a handwritten menu and maybe 7 tables max. And of course, Stephen Baker was already sitting right there. He was completely alone, his suit jacket slung over the back of his chair and his collar comfortably unbuttoned. He had a glass of rich red wine in front of him and a book resting face down on the table. He glanced up just as she stumbled onto the entry mat, dripping freezing rain everywhere. A heavy, loaded silence stretched between them before he finally broke it. "Sit down before you cause a flood," he ordered smoothly. She swallowed a laugh just in time and slid into the booth across from him, mostly because every other table was packed, and standing there awkwardly was simply not an option. When the waiter appeared, she immediately ordered a glass of wine, because honestly the only thing more dangerous than sitting across from Stephen Baker in a dimly lit, rainy restaurant is doing it completely sober. We all wear that heavy corporate armor from 9 to 5, the carefully managed, perfectly composed version of ourselves. But when you strip away the schedule, add a late-night storm, and throw 2 people together completely by accident, that professional facade instantly melts away. That tiny, unscripted gap between the office and the real world is where the actual truth lives. And surprisingly, they actually talked. They completely ignored the company, the executive search, and the crushing deliverables. Instead, he leaned in and asked her where she learned to push back so fiercely in conference rooms. She opened up about her very first corporate gig out of college down in Atlanta, where a senior partner pulled her aside on week 2 to tell her she was simply too much for their high-end clients. She confessed how she spent the entire next year shrinking herself down to be just palatable enough. He slowly swirled his wine, genuinely captivated. "And after that?" he prompted. Jane held his gaze. "I became my own client," she fired back. He let that hang in the air, studying her with that intense, surgical focus she had been trying to decode for the last 2 weeks. It was a potent mix of raw desire and sudden, shocking recognition. He was finally finding the exact puzzle piece he'd been searching for. "You didn't grow up with much," he observed quietly, stripping away any judgment. "No," she admitted. "Neither did I." He stared down at his glass. "Different kind of nothing, probably." "Probably," she agreed softly. There is something profoundly disarming about locking eyes with someone across a crowded room and realizing they had to build their entire life from the exact same scraps you did. It doesn't magically fix your problems, but it instantly thins out the armor. When you finally meet someone who truly gets the hustle, the late nights and the sheer grit it took just to get a seat at the table, you stop performing. You can finally just exhale, because there is absolutely zero point in pretending you have always been bulletproof in front of someone who recognizes your exact scars. The storm eventually broke, but neither of them even noticed. They were still deep in conversation at 9:45 when the waiter finally dropped the check. Stephen smoothly intercepted it before she could even reach for her purse, and for once she didn't fight him on it. They stepped out into the slick, wet street. The freezing air made their breath visible, and the washed-out city was practically glittering around them. They lingered on the sidewalk, caught in that heavy, unspoken gravity. "Thank you for the company," he murmured. "I didn't plan it." "Neither did I," Jane replied. "I know," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "That's exactly what I liked about it." The sudden downpour had completely washed away the formal corporate boundary between them, dissolving it like chalk on wet pavement. He made the first move, just a subtle shift in weight, closing the dangerous gap between them. He reached up, gently brushing a damp strand of hair from her face, his fingers grazing her cold cheek right before his mouth found hers. It was incredibly deliberate and deeply certain. This wasn't one of those fumbling, nervous first kisses where you're trying to figure each other out. This was the kiss of a man who had made up his mind and was absolutely refusing to second-guess it. She kissed him right back, her hands instinctively grabbing the front of his shirt to pull him closer. When they finally broke apart, he just rested his forehead against hers, keeping his eyes closed in the quiet street. It felt incredibly intimate, like he was finally setting down a heavy weight he'd been carrying for years. And then, right on cue, her phone aggressively buzzed in her bag. She already knew exactly who was ruining the moment. She slowly stepped back and he let her slip away. "Good night, Miss Mitte," he whispered. "Good night, Mr. Baker," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. She practically sprinted to the corner of Erie and Rush before digging out her phone. The message glared back at her. "I need that org chart by end of week. This is your reminder." Standing there alone in the freezing November air, with the city rushing blindly past her, Jane felt the very first, terrifying fracture. It was that clean, sharp crack right down the center of her chest, warning her that her entire double life was about to shatter. Jane desperately tried to pull back, burying herself in the actual work, so her sudden distance would just look like intense professional dedication rather than outright avoidance. She started arriving before dawn and leaving long after dark, losing herself in a project that was actually incredibly fulfilling. Against all odds, she was building exactly what Baker Industries needed, a powerhouse leadership team packed with the kind of quiet, deep-rooted competence that doesn't need to shout to be heard. She had always been exceptional at her job, but against every single ironclad rule she had ever set for herself, she was completely free-falling. There is a very specific, soul-crushing kind of exhaustion that comes from aggressively performing loyalty while actively practicing betrayal. Imagine being genuinely brilliant at building something you were specifically hired to destroy. You start deeply caring about the work and the people, all while secretly undermining the exact man who handed you the keys to the kingdom. You can tell yourself it's just business all you want, but the guilt still eats you alive. Since that rainy night, Stephen hadn't kissed her again, or even mentioned the restaurant. In the boardroom, he was his usual precise, demanding self, constantly measuring everyone's performance. But every now and then, right as a marathon meeting wrapped up, his gaze would lock onto hers for just a fraction of a second too long. That lingering look was all the proof she needed that the electric tension from Erie Street was still burning right beneath the surface, completely unresolved. The reality check hit hard on a random Thursday afternoon. Jane was walking past his open office door when she caught the tail end of a tense phone call. He was aggressively ordering someone to freeze everything until he found out exactly who had accessed a highly confidential file, even if they had to drag the legal department into it. Jane didn't break her stride, marching straight to her desk and flipping open her laptop. She knew exactly which file he was hunting down because 2 weeks prior, alone in the office at 11 p.m., she was the one who opened it. She hadn't been stupid enough to copy or forward the document. She just read it with cold, calculated efficiency and fired off a tight summary to R. Sitting perfectly still at her desk, the math was suddenly terrifying. Stephen already knew there was a mole and he was rapidly closing the net. It was only a matter of time. We all have those quiet, agonizing crossroads in life. It's not the explosive, dramatic movie moments. It's that heavy, suffocating realization sitting at your desk on a Tuesday when you know the path you're on is about to blow up in your face. I think we've all been there, staring down a massive, life-altering decision that we desperately keep putting off because making the choice makes the fallout real. You refuse to do the math because you are terrified of what the final number actually costs. The pressure cooker exploded at 8 p.m. when R finally called, his voice dripping with impatience as he accused her of dragging her feet. Jane immediately shot back that she was just being careful, but R wasn't having it. He demanded the highly classified Q4 board presentation materials, completely changing the scope of her mission to intercept Baker's upcoming pitch to 3 major investors. When Jane argued that this massive breach wasn't part of their original deal, the conversation took a very dark turn. The fake warmth that usually softened their calls vanished instantly. R coldly reminded her to just do her job, dropping a heavily veiled threat about exposing the messy, buried truth of how things really ended with her last employer down in Atlanta. Jane's jaw clenched tight. She managed to buy herself a little time, begging for an extension until next week, but R gave her a hard deadline of Friday before he started making calls. He hung up before she could even process the threat. Alone in Cassie's sprawling apartment, with the Chicago skyline bleeding through the glass, Jane pressed her shaking hands flat against her knees, desperately trying to find something solid to hold on to. By 8 a.m. the next morning, she walked into the strategy meeting running purely on fumes. Stephen was already holding court, but when he looked up at her, that usual guarded, measured expression was totally gone. He was looking at her with a direct, intense vulnerability, publicly ordering her to sit in on the highly confidential, closed-door board prep for the rest of the week. The entire room shifted uncomfortably because outsourced recruiters absolutely do not get that kind of VIP access. Jane forced out a smooth agreement, taking her seat while her phone buzzed relentlessly under the table with yet another demanding message from R. Jane had absolutely zero professional obligations to be anywhere near Stephen Baker's orbit that Saturday. With no office hours, no scheduled calls, and no pending deliverables, she spent the entire day failing miserably to get any actual work done. She sat paralyzed on Cassie's couch, helplessly watching the Chicago skyline turn a slow, sluggish gray, while she read the same paragraph 4 times and circled the exact thing she was desperately trying to avoid. At 4 p.m., her phone finally buzzed. It was a text from Stephen, asking for an hour of her time to fix a massive crisis with the Harmon file. You always know when a road is iced over long before you actually hit the brakes. The warning signs are flashing right in front of you. The crash is entirely predictable, and yet you keep your foot squarely on the gas anyway. She immediately texted back that she was on her way. His penthouse was up on the 42nd floor. She had always known he lived right above her, but acknowledging it abstractly and actually standing face to face with his heavy oak door were two completely different realities. When he opened the door, the intimidating corporate armor was entirely gone. He was wearing a faded grey t-shirt and dark jeans, giving her a stripped-down off-the-clock view of the CEO that she had been actively trying to block from her mind. He ushered her in. The penthouse was stunningly intentional, massive, minimalist, bathed in moody natural light and absolutely packed with books. They sat at opposite ends of his sprawling kitchen island to tackle the Harmon crisis. There actually was a legitimate disaster with conflicting candidate references, and for 40 solid minutes they were just two high-level professionals ruthlessly putting out a fire. "Files closed," Stephen murmured, shutting his laptop with a soft click. The sudden silence in the massive kitchen was deafening. Jane kept her eyes glued to her cold coffee. "Harmon is handled. You should have the revised brief by Tuesday morning." Stephen didn't move away. Instead, he leaned against the marble counter, closing the distance between them until she could feel the heat radiating off him. "I didn't ask you up here just to fix the Harmon file, Jane." Hearing him use her first name completely shifted the gravity in the room. That single syllable carried so much raw, unfiltered intention that the air suddenly felt thick and heavy. She finally looked up, meeting his intense gaze. "Then why am I here?" she asked, her voice dropping a fraction. Stephen reached out, his fingertips lightly grazing the knuckles of her hand resting on the island. "Because there are 5 other people who could have solved this problem, and I realized I was actively looking for an excuse to get you in this room. Let's get one thing straight. The shift that happened next was the inevitable collision of 2 people who had spent weeks aggressively circling each other from a safe professional distance. Eventually, you run out of excuses to keep up the act the second you are alone in a room with 0 audience and no agenda." He guided her away from the harsh kitchen lights and into the dim, quiet expanse of the living room. They sank onto the deep couch facing the glittering skyline, entirely abandoning their professional boundaries. The conversation turned deeply personal, their voices dropping into that hushed, intimate register reserved for the middle of the night. He shared the story behind the old photograph on his credenza, his thumb absent-mindedly tracing slow, burning circles on her wrist the entire time. Every subtle touch felt like a live wire. The conversation eventually slowed, leaving only the heavy magnetic pull between them. Stephen shifted closer, entirely invading her personal space. His hand slid slowly up her neck, his fingers tangling slightly in her hair as his thumb rested gently against her jawline. "You make it incredibly hard to think straight," he whispered, his eyes dropping to her lips. "You're the one who invited me up," she breathed back, completely unable and entirely unwilling to pull away. The kiss was inevitable, deliberate, and deeply consuming. It carried the heavy weight of weeks of agonizing restraint, completely dissolving any remaining distance between them. She surrendered entirely, letting the corporate espionage, the restricted files and the terrifying threat of R completely vanish into the background. They spent hours tangled together in the quiet dark of the penthouse, trading breathless conversations and slow, exploring touches, wrapped in a fiercely intimate bubble that felt dangerously permanent. There is a profound, almost bone-deep exhaustion that comes from constantly fighting your own instincts. When you finally drop the rope and stop warring with what you actually feel, it doesn't just feel good. It feels like you can finally breathe again after holding your breath for months. Sometime after 2 in the morning, she slipped quietly out of his bed while he was fast asleep. The penthouse was pitch black as she gathered her clothes and padded softly toward the front door. But as she passed the kitchen island where they had been working just hours before, her blood ran ice cold. Sitting right on the counter was an open folder. The tab read, Mitte, J. External Contractor Audit. Sitting perfectly visible inside was a freshly printed summary with server access logs and timestamps. He already knew someone breached the restricted files, and her name was officially on the suspect list. He might not have all the puzzle pieces yet, but he was terrifyingly close. Jane softly clicked the front door shut, rode the elevator down 8 agonizing floors, and sat utterly paralyzed in Cassie's dark apartment until the sun came up. Jane desperately wanted to buy herself more time, frantically searching for some miraculous loophole where she could feed Vantage just enough scraps to keep them satisfied without completely torpedoing Baker Industries. She wanted to finish out her contract and vanish like a ghost before the fallout hit. But her borrowed time officially expired on Wednesday afternoon. Stephen summoned her to his office at exactly 3 p.m. The second she walked in, the heavy, calculated way he studied her completely gave it away. He looked exactly like an auditor who just found a massive, glaring discrepancy and is silently deciding exactly how to drop the hammer. "Close the door," he ordered, his voice dangerously quiet. She clicked it shut, remaining rigidly on her feet because taking a seat felt entirely too much like surrendering. "I'm going to ask you a very direct question, and I expect the absolute, unvarnished truth," he stated, locking onto her gaze. "The server access log on the Q3 structural file we discussed last week. Your credentials triggered the breach." It was a definitive, lethal statement hanging in the air. "Stephen," she started, her voice faltering, "were you the one who accessed it?" He interrupted, cutting straight to the bone. The deafening silence swallowed the sprawling 42 floors of Chicago gridlock below them. The vintage photograph of his parents sat heavily on the credenza next to that damning audit folder on his desk, which had grown significantly thicker since Saturday. We all have that one nightmare scenario we aggressively outrun, convincing ourselves we can dodge the fallout forever. Jane had been sprinting away from this exact confession since the second her flight touched down at O'Hare. She had built an entire fantasy where she would successfully pull off the heist and disappear before the ugly truth ever saw the light of day. But here she was, cornered in his glass-walled office with absolutely zero exits remaining. "Yes," she finally whispered, the word physically hurting her throat. Stephen stayed perfectly still, absorbing the blow as she forced herself to keep going. "I was secretly hired by Vantage Group long before I ever set foot in this building," she confessed, maintaining a painfully steady composure that required every ounce of her remaining willpower. "My recruiting contract and the actual placement work are entirely genuine. But my primary objective was extracting your confidential blueprints for the new division. They wanted the org chart, your key executive hires, and the core investment strategy." A suffocating quiet filled the room before he finally demanded, "Exactly what did you hand over to them?" She quickly swore she only provided a basic summary of the team structure, desperately clarifying she withheld the critical board materials and stopped feeding them intel immediately after. Her voice completely died in her throat. "After what, Jane?" he pushed, his voice cracking slightly under the immense weight of the betrayal. She swallowed hard, utterly unable to finish the sentence. He slowly stood up and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, shoving his hands deep into his pockets as he stared blankly out at the freezing expanse of Lake Michigan. "How long have you actually known it was me?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Since Monday morning," he replied flatly, keeping his back to her. It finally narrowed down the server access window directly to your credentials and your specific off hours. Monday, exactly 2 days ago, right after she slipped out of his bed. She squeezed her eyes shut as the devastating timeline clicked into place. You knew on Saturday, she realized, the horror washing over her. I strongly suspected it on Saturday, he corrected, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. But I desperately wanted to be wrong. I desperately wanted to be wrong. Honestly, I think that is the most utterly heartbreaking sentence in the English language. It means you are staring dead at the undeniable proof, but you actively choose to play the fool just to buy yourself a few more hours of happiness. I've been there, holding onto a relationship that was clearly bleeding out, ignoring every massive red flag, because accepting the reality meant the whole house of cards was going to collapse. You willingly blind yourself because being right costs you absolutely everything. I am so incredibly sorry. Jane choked out to his rigid back. He remained facing the glass, completely emotionally detached. You need to clear out of this building immediately, he ordered with clinical precision. I'll have the security team officially handle the termination of your contract, and they will courier your personal items to your temporary residence. Stephen, please, she begged, stepping forward. Ms. Mitte, he cut her off sharply, the brutal reversion to her formal title slamming shut like a heavy steel vault. She numbly gathered her portfolio and walked over to the door, resting her trembling hand against the heavy metal frame for support. Everything I built here was real, she pleaded one last time, desperate to leave him with something untainted. That executive team is genuinely exceptional. Please don't tear it down just because I'm the one who put it together. He offered absolutely nothing in return, just a cold, devastating silence. She walked out, leaving her entire life scattered in pieces on his office floor. It only took Jane 40 minutes to pack up her entire life. She had always been an expert at traveling light, carrying the deeply ingrained survival instincts passed down from her grandmother Edna. When you are raised by a fiercely independent woman on a fixed income down in Atlanta, you get a kitchen table education in pure self-reliance and learn very early on to only carry what you can physically carry yourself. It was a harsh philosophy that had served Jane incredibly well, ensuring she never owned more than she could quickly throw into the trunk of a car when it was time to run. She immediately booked a one-way ticket back to Atlanta, desperately trying to convince herself it was just a strategic reset rather than a full-blown retreat. She absolutely refused to break down or call anyone for help. Instead, she sat on the edge of Cassie's pristine white couch one last time, staring out through the floor-to-ceiling windows at the glittering Chicago grid. Her mind ruthlessly replayed the image of the man who had sat across from her in that tiny, rain-soaked restaurant, owning his gritty past with absolute confidence, totally devoid of shame or apologies. I desperately wanted to be wrong. The devastating echo of his voice finally pushed her to grab her bag and walk out the door. Meanwhile, Stephen remained anchored in his office long past midnight. With his assistant gone since 7 and the executive floor completely deserted, he stood frozen at the exact same window where she had just shattered his reality. He stared out at the freezing lake, meticulously trying to piece together a logical, sterile version of the betrayal. It was an undeniable fact that she was a corporate spy planted to gut his company, and the server logs proved she had accessed the restricted files. But here was the glaring inconsistency that kept completely derailing his anger. At some crucial point during her mission, she had actively chosen to stop. He wasn't relying on blind faith or charity to reach that conclusion. He had ruthlessly audited the servers 3 separate times, confirming that the highly classified board materials, the absolute crown jewels of Baker Industries, were completely untouched. She had full access to the kill shot, and she deliberately walked away without taking it. There is a massive difference between stopping because you get caught and stopping because your conscience finally overrides your survival instinct. She didn't know he was actively hunting the mole when she backed off. She abandoned the mission entirely because a man made her a quiet cup of coffee on a Saturday afternoon and shared memories of his parents in an Evanston garden. Somewhere in the middle of that deeply intimate, unguarded conversation, the massive payout simply stopped being worth the price of his trust. Driven by that nagging realization, he called his head of security, ordering a ruthless deep dive into Vantage Group's shady recruitment tactics. He needed to know exactly how they pressured their contractors, explicitly demanding a full, unredacted background check on Jane Mitte, starting from her roots in Atlanta. When the encrypted dossier finally hit his inbox at 2 a.m., he read it standing at the exact same kitchen island where they had tackled the Harmon file. The same spot where her laugh had completely disarmed him, making him realize for the first time in years how much he genuinely hated the idea of an empty penthouse. The report laid out a brutal, infuriating timeline. Back in Atlanta, her former supervisor had fabricated a vicious misconduct report to destroy her career simply because Jane had flat out refused to participate in a massive pricing fraud scheme. The mess had been quietly swept under the rug with a suffocating NDA, chaining her future to a reference letter strictly controlled by her abusers. Vantage Group had somehow acquired that NDA and weaponized it against her, holding her entire livelihood hostage to force her into corporate espionage. He slowly set the tablet down on the marble counter, his eyes locking onto the heavy front door as the entire puzzle finally snapped into place. Let me be absolutely clear about something. There is a special place in hell for people who weaponize someone's past trauma to control their present. It is the ultimate form of cowardice. Anyone who digs up a closed chapter of your life just to hold it over your head isn't playing a game of leverage. They are showing you exactly how weak they truly are. Blackmail doesn't make you powerful, it makes you a parasite. And realizing that Jane wasn't a cold-blooded traitor, but a trapped woman desperately trying to survive a hostage situation, completely flipped the script. She hadn't been playing a character. She had been completely authentic with him, right down to the agonizing moment she walked into his office and confessed the betrayal before she even knew she was officially caught. He immediately grabbed his phone, but her number went straight to voicemail. After 2 failed attempts, he sprinted down to her floor, only to find Cassie's apartment completely dark and abandoned. Standing in the dead silence of the hallway, he pulled out his phone and pulled up the flight schedules for Atlanta. There was a direct flight leaving at 7:15 a.m. He hesitated for just a fraction of a second, absorbing the massive weight of the decision the way he always did before pulling the trigger. And then he booked the flight. O'Hare at 6 a.m. operates like an entirely different planet, running purely on harsh fluorescent lights, the endless rattle of rolling luggage and passengers clinging to their coffee cups like absolute lifelines. Jane navigated the chaos on complete autopilot, blindly breezing through check-in and security until she collapsed into a row of stiff chairs at gate C14. She stared blankly out the massive windows at the pitch-black tarmac, watching a plane's tail lights blink patiently in the freezing dawn. She slid a single earbud in, but couldn't even bring herself to press play. There is a very specific, hollow kind of exhaustion that hits you when the fight is finally over. It is that heavy, bone-deep fatigue that crashes over you the second your body stops running on pure adrenaline and survival mode. As Jane sat frozen at gate C14, she wasn't mourning the loss of the job or celebrating her escape. She was just entirely consumed by the deafening silence of the aftermath. She heard his rough gravel voice long before she actually saw him. Jane. Hearing her first name slice through the sterile airport noise made her heart physically drop. She turned around. Stephen Baker was planted at the very edge of the boarding area. The corporate armor was completely gone, replaced by a dark wool coat left thrown open over his shirt, as if he had sprinted straight out the door. He looked exactly like a guy who had just recklessly blown down the Kennedy Expressway at 5 in the morning and was absolutely prepared to bet the house on whatever happened next. A few nearby passengers glanced up at the intense energy radiating off him before quickly looking away. Jane stayed rigidly in her seat, clutching her bag. "How did you even find me?" "Your flight was booked through the corporate portal," he replied, taking a slow step closer. "I still have administrative access." She swallowed hard, trying to maintain some shred of distance. "You should be getting ready for the office, Mr. Baker." "I don't have to be there for another 4 hours," he murmured, closing the gap until he was towering over her. "I read your unredacted Atlanta file, Jane." The air between them suddenly felt suffocatingly thick. "I know exactly how Vantage Group cornered you," he continued, his voice dropping into a fierce, protective register. "I know about the NDA. I know exactly what that bastard Caldwell pulled." Jane met his gaze, refusing to play the victim or ask for pity. Having a gun to my head doesn't magically erase what I actually did to you, Stephen. No, he agreed softly. It doesn't. Here is the absolute core of the human experience. Stephen didn't race to O'Hare to neatly sweep everything under the rug and pretend the betrayal never happened. He showed up because he finally realized that a clean record matters way less than a real connection. I genuinely believe that true love, or whatever incredibly messy, beautiful thing these two are building, isn't about finding someone flawless. It's about looking at someone's absolute worst mistake, seeing the impossible choices they were forced to make, and aggressively choosing them anyway. I didn't drive out here to physically block you from getting on that plane, he confessed, the raw vulnerability bleeding into his tone. I came to tell you that I finally understand why you walked into my building, and more importantly, I understand exactly why you chose to stop. Stephen, please don't. I also came to tell you that the executive team you built is staying exactly where they are. He cut in smoothly. I personally reviewed every single placement. Your work is completely bulletproof. Jane stared at him, watching the busy gate slowly fill up with bleary-eyed passengers and rolling suitcases, totally oblivious to the absolute emotional wrecking ball swinging between them. So, let me get this straight, she whispered. You tore across the city at dawn just to give me a performance review? Hardly, he fired back. He took one final, deliberate step forward, invading her personal space entirely. I came because you tried to vanish into thin air without giving me a single damn vote in how this story ends. Jane stood up, putting herself squarely at eye level with him, completely refusing to back down. You literally ordered me out of your office. I know exactly what I said in that room. His voice dropped to a gravelly whisper, his eyes intensely searching hers. I'm standing here right now telling you what I actually mean. Jane's breathing hitched. I lied to your face for weeks, Stephen. I infiltrated your company, I invaded your life, and I had absolutely no business being in your penthouse. He reached out, his knuckles brushing infinitely lightly against her cheek. And yet, he murmured, here I am, practically begging you to stay. Right on cue, the harsh overhead speaker blasted the final boarding call for first class, Zone 1. It was the ultimate reality check, her flight, her assigned seat, her final escape hatch. Jane slowly grabbed the handle of her carry-on. I have a ticket, Stephen. I know you do, he replied, his hands dropping to his sides, refusing to physically stop her. She forced herself to turn around, walking blindly toward the jet bridge. He didn't chase her. He didn't call her name again. He just stood there, taking the hit. She made it exactly 3 steps away from the scanning agent before her legs entirely gave out. She froze. The sprawling city of Chicago was still sitting right there in the rearview mirror. 42 floors of glass, a heated rooftop pool, a tiny Italian joint on Erie Street, and a massive kitchen island covered in chaotic paperwork. She slowly spun back around. Stephen was still planted in the exact same spot, holding his breath. Jane marched right back to him, dropping her suitcase onto the thin airport carpet with a heavy thud. The electric tension between them was absolutely deafening. That flight is completely non-refundable, she pointed out, her voice shaking with a tiny, breathless laugh. I will personally buy you a brand new one, Stephen fired right back, closing the last inch of space between them. If you ever actually decide you want to leave. The gate agent aggressively announced the final closing of the jet bridge doors. Jane didn't even flinch. She just looked up at him, really, truly looked at him, completely dropping the corporate armor she had been hiding behind since that very first elevator ride. I have absolutely no idea how to do this, she confessed, her voice cracking. Stephen's hands came up to frame her face, his thumbs gently sweeping across her cheekbones. I know, he breathed, leaning in until their lips were barely a breath apart. Neither do I. That is not exactly reassuring, Mr. Baker. I know that too, Jane. She finally let a genuine, brilliant smile break across her face, right as his mouth crashed down on hers, and the heavy metal door of gate C-14 slammed securely shut. Spring dragged its feet, hitting Chicago that year, finally exploding in mid-April. The city literally flipped from a miserable winter gray to vibrant green overnight, almost like it had finally received permission to breathe. Jane was living on the 31st floor now, in a place completely her own, She had signed the lease back in January, funding the deposit with a massive project fee from a brand new independent consulting contract she had hustled for entirely on her own terms. The apartment boasted incredible morning light, a sprawling kitchen counter perpetually buried under client files, and a killer view of the lake. She was perched at that exact counter on a lazy Saturday morning, letting her coffee go completely cold, when a heavy knock rattled the door. She knew exactly who was on the other side before her hand even touched the doorknob. Stephen Baker was standing in the hallway, looking effortlessly sharp in a dark blazer with an open collar, holding a familiar grease-stained paper bag from that tiny Italian joint on Erie Street. He wore the fiercely determined expression of a man who had calculated every possible risk and decided the payout was absolutely worth it. "I was just in the neighborhood," he offered with a totally straight face. "Stephen, you literally live 2 floors up," she fired back, raising an eyebrow. "Exactly," he replied smoothly. They shared a long, loaded look holding the heavy weight of the last 6 months. They had survived marathon phone calls, stretching deep into the night, dinners that kicked off strictly professional before bleeding into dangerously intimate territory, and the incredibly messy, unscripted business of rebuilding trust completely from scratch. He was still the most ruthlessly controlled guy she had ever encountered, and according to him, she remained the single most maddeningly unpredictable woman on the planet. But somewhere in the middle of all that chaos, they completely agreed those traits were massive upgrades rather than actual flaws. She stepped aside to let him in. He casually took over her kitchen, dumping her cold coffee to brew a fresh pot with the quiet, confident ease of a guy who had genuinely earned his place in her life and refused to take a single second of it for granted. Handing her a steaming mug, he crowded into her space. "I have some news," he murmured. "The Vantage Group investigation officially wrapped up last week. My legal team cornered them into a massive settlement, and as of this morning, that suffocating NDA from your Atlanta nightmare is entirely voided. It's totally unenforceable." Jane froze, the massive weight of the last few years suddenly lifting off her chest. "You specifically went after them for that," she whispered in disbelief. "My lawyers executed the strike," he corrected smoothly. "I just pointed the weapon." "You never should have been forced to carry that heavy baggage, Jane." She set her mug down and really looked at him, taking in the sharp jaw, the dark beard, and that incredibly rare, soft expression he strictly reserved for moments of absolute certainty. He was completely certain about her. She reached up, framing his face with both hands, and pulled him into a deep, desperate kiss. It was a fiercely intentional, soul-bearing kiss that completely shattered the cautious boundaries they had been tiptoeing around for half a year. He kissed her right back, with that same possessive intensity, exactly like the man who tore across the city to O'Hare at dawn and refused to regret a single second of the fallout. "I've walked you through every twist of this insane corporate chess match, and honestly, I am a massive sucker for the complicated love stories. I'm not talking about the fairy tale romances that fall perfectly into place without a scratch. I'm talking about the gritty, battle-tested connections that survive absolute disaster. When 2 people witness each other at their most manipulative, terrified and vulnerable states and still actively choose to stay together, that foundation is virtually indestructible. Outside, the April sun glittered off Lake Michigan, while Chicago hummed its chaotic, beautiful tune far below. Inside, 2 hot cups of coffee sat ignored next to a paper bag from Erie Street on a perfectly wide-open Saturday. Jane leaned back against her kitchen counter with Stephen's hands resting heavily on her waist, soaking in the quiet peace of a morning that belonged entirely to 2 people who finally stopped fighting and simply chose each other. So, after watching them drag each other through hell to get here, what's your verdict? Can a relationship built on a foundation of massive corporate deception actually go the distance? Or does a poisoned beginning always dictate a tragic end? Drop your fiercely honest opinions in the comments below. I read every single one and I need to know what you think. Thank you guys so much for sticking with me to the very end of this one. If you are loving these new, high-stakes romance stories we're bringing to the channel, do me a huge favor and hit that subscribe button so you never miss a chapter. It truly means the world to me. And seriously, Jump into the comments right now and let me know. What are you thinking about this new era of love stories? Are you here for the intense drama, or do you want to see a different kind of twist next time? Let's talk about it down below, and I'll see you in the next one.